I am very excited to be sharing this knowledge and this wisdom with you all today. I think this is so important for every single woman to know about her body. And quite frankly, I think the introduction of hormonal birth control, and now, there's a lot of different birth control methods now. The implant, which would be the implant in the arm, which would be a hormonal form of birth control. And then there's IUDs, hormonal and non-hormonal. But I think a lot of the birth control methods have really disconnected women from their bodies in this way. And I'm definitely not a fan of any mechanical or hormonal forms of birth control. And I'm definitely more a fan of using cycle tracking for birth control, fertility awareness method. Natural family planning is another term. They're all basically the same. And we're going to be talking about that today. So I'm so excited to share this. I also wanted to share that I have a free resource on my website, bornfreefamily.com, that talks about cycle tracking specifically for birth control. But this is also a really great tool if you are trying to become pregnant, because of course you cannot become pregnant unless you are having sex in your fertile window, during that time of ovulation, slightly before, slightly after ovulation. So if you're not having sex, then you can't get pregnant. So that can be very helpful knowledge to know and understand if you are trying to become pregnant, or also if you're not trying to become pregnant. So the resource on my website is more geared towards pregnancy prevention, but you can use all of that same information that I have in there to become pregnant as well. And we will be talking about that today. So there are first we'll get into this. So did you know that there are only 2 to 6 days out of the month or out of your cycle where women are able to become pregnant? It is a very important aspect to have sex on the days that you are ovulating. So I kind of went into this before. So it can take a little bit to get comfortable with, but after a few months, once you start to notice the natural rhythms of your body, how your body's physical symptoms link up with what phase of your cycle you're in, getting to know your cervical fluid and, maybe some of the other methods. Once you get used to it, it can be a very, very reliable tool for birth control or for getting pregnant, if that is what you're interested in this phase of your life. So let's get into it. So the 3 things that we will be discussing today is cervical fluid, cervical position, and basal body temperature. So these are the 3 main tools in natural family planning, fertility awareness method, cycle tracking. These are, I think, your best resources when it comes to understanding your cycle, knowing what phase of your cycle you're in, and more specifically, like when you are ovulating. So if you're using this, there are so many reasons why you might want to understand your cycle and to know specifically what phase of your cycle you're in. But we're mainly going to be talking about pregnancy or pregnancy prevention. So we're really going to focus on the ovulation phase in this stream. So cervical fluid. The consistency of cervical fluid is a great indication of what phase of your cycle you are in. Your hormones cause your cervical fluid to change in texture, volume, and color throughout your cycle. Cervical fluid plays a very important role in helping women become pregnant. So cervical fluid helps sperm move through the cervix so it can fertilize the egg during ovulation. When you are not ovulating, cervical fluid prevents sperm or other substances from getting into the cervix. So it also works as a protective mechanism for your body. So There are 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, right? So first, the first day of your period is the mark of a new cycle. Typically, your cycle is going to be around 28 days. Some women have shorter cycles, some women have much longer cycles. So you will definitely have to get to know your own cycle. This is a good guide, though. I would say that the majority of women have around a 28-day cycle. So this can be a very helpful tool. So the first day of your period is, or the first day of your bleed is the first day of your cycle. So once you start bleeding, that is the menses or menstrual phase of your cycle. Then you have the follicular phase, then ovulation, and then there is the luteal phase, then back to menstruation. So right after your period, usually there isn't a lot of cervical fluid or discharge, right? So usually it's pretty dry or mostly dry. As sometimes the discharge can kind of come out in pieces, if that makes any sense. It's just a lot drier than some of the other phases of your cycle. So that's going to signal that you are not in your fertile window. The sticky phase, which is 4 to 6 days after your bleed, that's going to be like white or cloudy. It's going to be a little bit thicker, kind of creamy, but not as creamy as the creamy phase, obviously. So then once you get into that really creamy discharge, that really creamy cervical fluid, that's typically around days 7 to 9. Again, this is going to be different for everybody, so you'll have to chart this and just see how it lines up with your body. And it also might not be the same month to month. But when it's really thick and creamy, like a really creamy consistency, that is right before when you are going to, or when you, pretty much right before when you're going to ovulate typically. So at that point, you are semi-fertile. So if you are trying to not become pregnant, I would either use a backup form of birth control or contraception, like a condom, or some people like the pull-out method, whatever, no judgment if you wanna trust that. Or you can just abstain from sex altogether during that phase if you do not want to become pregnant. And then there is the jelly phase, clear phase. So this is the cervical fluid that you need to help the sperm travel through the cervix and make it up there to the egg that you ovulated. So this acts as a protective barrier, kind of, to protect the sperm from the pH of the vagina, and then to kind of also give it a ride up into the cervix. So the sperm, the ejaculate, and the cervical fluid, they all kind of work together to get the sperm up there through the cervix into the uterus to fertilize the egg. So this is going to have like an egg white consistency. It's going to be really stretchy and slippery. So I tell women sometimes when you've ovulated, and this is like kind of TMI, but whatever, I don't care. It's good. It's really helpful. So sometimes when you're wiping after you use the restroom, it's really slippery. Like it just like slides right back there. And that is usually a really clear indication that you have ovulated. That can also happen if you have had sex recently, within like the past 24 hours. Sometimes you'll get a similar discharge to this, I think. So that can be something to watch out for, because I have kind of freaked out before, like, oh my gosh, I really didn't think I was in that phase of my cycle yet. And, you know, we had sex and now I'm getting this cervical fluid that lines up to fertile cervical fluid. And it just, I don't know, sometimes the leftover ejaculate in the vagina or whatever can kind of make it seem that way. So that's why I think it's helpful to use multiple forms of like multiple tools when you are cycle tracking, because it can just give you a little bit more confidence. So yes, and then I'll show you another phase. So this is kind of how I like this graphic a lot. This is how it lines up with like your actual like follicular and luteal phase, and then ovulation. So you can kind of see what the body's physically doing in the middle there. You can kind of see the egg doing its thing. And then you can also see how that lines up with your cervical fluid, the graphic at the top. And then it also shows what your hormones are doing at that time. So you might notice that your estrogen is really peaking during that, around that ovulatory phase, right? And then it comes back down, and then your progesterone is increasing, like it's really low during your period or your bleed, and then it's increasing during the luteal phase. So that is just interesting information to know, and I really like this graphic, how it just lines everything up. I find that to be very helpful. So before we move on, I just want to make sure that there's nothing. Yeah, I guess that's all I want to say about this. So actually, there's a few different methods that you can use to check your cervical fluid. You can see if anything comes off while you are wiping yourself after you go to the bathroom. That can be a time that you can check it. You can also stick your finger up your vagina and then see if anything comes off of your finger, or you can check it while you're in the shower. So those are a few ways that you can check it. Obviously, use clean hands. Wash your hands after. And then cervical position. So this is another tool that you can use while you are cycle tracking. This can be like this tool can take a little bit to get comfortable with, because the fluctuations in the position and the feeling and the texture of your cervix can be, it seems, sometimes for some people it seems quite obvious, but I find for a lot of women, it doesn't seem so obvious. So yeah, it will probably take you months of consistently checking your cervical position every day. This is another one that I recommend doing in the shower. Just doing either standing up or sitting down, but you want to make sure you're doing it in the same position every time, because the position of your cervix can change if you're sitting down or if you're standing up. So to make sure you're really like understanding what's going on in there, doing it in the same position every time you do it will be really helpful. And then you can just chart down what results you're getting, right? So it's like, okay, well, I'm day 3 of my cycle. It feels low and a little bit open, and I'm having, you know, little to no cervical fluid. And then maybe you can even write down some of the other symptoms, like, oh, I was feeling, you know, really sad today, or maybe I was feeling like really cranky today. Whatever, like whatever you can come up with, and you can see if there's a pattern. And I find like when you can tune into your body mentally and physically in these ways, it can just become second nature. Like you just immediately know, oh, yep, I'm about to get my period, or yep, I think I'm about to ovulate, once you can really start to understand these different techniques. So let me find my notes. Yeah, so the cervix changes position, obviously, depending on what phase of your cycle you're in. The cervical position during ovulation is going to be high, and your cervix is going to feel soft, a little bit more wet, and it is also going to be slightly open. So if you've had a baby before, right, it's not going to be as open as right before you give birth. It's still going to be like maybe 2 centimeters or less. But if you're consistently checking your cervical position, you will probably notice a difference in the openness. So there's an acronym, SHOW, that can help you remember what your cervix is going to feel like around ovulation. So SHOW stands for soft, high, open, and wet. So that can be helpful. And then after ovulation, the cervical position becomes low and the cervix becomes firm, much drier, and closed. When the cervix is in a low position, you might feel your cervix with your finger in the vagina up to your first knuckle. So you might not even have to stick your finger very far into your vagina to be able to feel your cervix. And I know some women really notice this, especially if they're having sex, because it's like, whoa, like you can feel it right there. And so yes, that's why your cervix is changing position. It's depending on what phase of your cycle you're in. So, yep. Let me see what else. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much cervical position. And then we'll also talk about basal body temperature. So this is a temperature chart that we would use if we were tracking basal body temperature. So the important part about basal body temperature is you can't use just any thermometer, and there is a little bit of like restrictions in whether this is going to be consistent. And there's like a few ground rules that you'll have to follow to be able to get accurate results while taking your basal body temperature. So essentially, behind like what the reasoning behind this is, your temperature is going to increase significantly after ovulation, and then it kind of stays elevated during the luteal phase. And then right before you get your period, it's going to drop back down. So this is really cool because it can tell you, this can be very accurate. Like if you're following all of the rules and like restrictions with taking your basal body temperature, you can know, like wake up in the morning, take your temperature. I'm going to get my period today because my temperature dropped 2 points or whatever. So it can be really cool for that. The only thing is, you know how I said your temperature increases after ovulation. So I would not only use this as a form of birth control because you don't know until after you've already ovulated. The temperature doesn't increase until after you have already ovulated. So it might go up a little gradually. It's different for everybody, but typically during your bleed and then during the follicular phase, it's going to be pretty low. And then it increases during ovulation or right after ovulation. And then it stays pretty elevated. And then sometimes, how you can see here, sometimes it drops a little bit right before ovulation and then it skyrockets up. So for some women, it will consistently drop right before ovulation. But as you can see in that chart, it does not drop very much. So yeah, I like this. It works for some women. It doesn't work for me because of my lifestyle, and I'll go into a little bit about like the specifics of that. But this works really well for some women, but I would recommend that I would always recommend mesh all of these together, or like do whatever works for you. But I like to use multiple things, and I think that is a little bit more reliable. Okay, and then this is another example of a chart. So basal body temperature. So like I said, during your bleed and the follicular phase, it's going to be lower, skyrockets up after ovulation and through the luteal phase, and then right before your bleed, it's going to drop back down. That's going to be a very small shift. So it's maybe, you know, during menstruation, you're hanging out at 97, like the low 97s. And then maybe after ovulation, you're hanging out in 98 around there. So it's not going to be several degrees. It's going to be very slight changes. So when you're taking your basal body temperature, you're going to need to use an oral thermometer that goes to the 100th degree. So it can't, normally most thermometers, it's going to be 98.6, right? It's not 98.62. So you will need a special thermometer that is used to take your basal body temperature. It can't just go to the 10th place. It has to also go to the 100th place. So that is very important because some of these fluctuations are going to be so subtle. You need it to go to the 100th place. So a few things that would make this not really work well for your lifestyle, or these are a few things that could affect your temperature and not make it consistent. If you don't get good sleep, so if you have insomnia, or if you work night shift, or just if you have a one-off night of bad sleep, you might notice that if you're taking your basal body temperature, that it's not really consistent with how you usually trend. Poor sleep, that's going to be like pretty much anything less than 6 or 7 hours, that can affect what the result is going to be. If you're on hormonal birth control, so if you're taking the birth control pill, if you have a hormonal IUD, this is not going to work because you're not ovulating. So you're not actually getting a cycle at all. Those forms of birth control are essentially hijacking your cycle. So there would just, I mean, this would be great to transition off of birth control and to use this as a form of birth control instead, but you can't do it until you've already detoxed all of the synthetic hormones and whatnot from your body, and once you regain your cycle, which can take several months for some women that have IUDs or some form of hormonal birth control. Another lifestyle thing that might not jive well with this would be breastfeeding and co-sleeping. So co-sleeping and breastfeeding moms know, or even any parent with a little kid, you know, you are probably waking up in the middle of the night. You are not probably going to consistently get that 6 or 7 or more hours of sleep, and that can affect the results of your temperature in the morning. So not always, like some women still do it, but it just wouldn't be as reliable, I don't think. The other thing is you're going to want to take your temperature at the same time every day. So if you're someone like me who doesn't wake up at the same time every day, and it doesn't have to be the same exact time, but you don't want to take it at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then sometimes you take it at noon. You want to kind of take it right when you wake up, before you brush your teeth, before you drink anything, before you eat anything. It should be the very first thing you do when you wake up in the morning, hopefully consistently, like ballpark at the same time. And for people that have really consistent schedules, that is usually not an issue. Just leave the thermometer right on your nightstand, wake up, take your temperature, and then you're good to go. Write it down, plug it into an app. If you're using an app to help you track your cycle, you can just plug the results in there. Yes, so yeah, so I think that's all I needed to say about that. So yeah, some of the options to track your cycle are, you can use apps. So there are dozens of apps these days. A lot of them are free. Some of them are so fancy that they talk and communicate to the thermometer you're using, and it automatically plugs the data into the app. So that's really cool. There's also, I don't remember what they're called, but there's a ring. And then there's also like sometimes Apple Watches, or like there's bracelets that take your temperature, your heart rate, they track your sleep and all this sort of stuff. Some women use that to monitor their basal body temperature, and just they use all of that data while they're tracking their cycle. So that can be a really cool thing that you could use. So you can see, like, explore what kind of apps there are, see what works best for you. I used an app for a little bit, and then now I literally have a note in my phone, and I just like take very basic notes on my cervical fluid, sometimes the position of my cervix. The main one I use for my cycle tracking purposes is monitoring my cervical fluid and my discharge. That I feel like gives me enough information to be able to use it as a very reliable form of birth control. But I have also been doing this for years. So especially if you're just starting out and you really do not want to become pregnant right now, I would use at least 3 of these methods. There's also a couple other things you can, well, before I get into that, you can also jot down this data in a journal. So you can keep a journal on your nightstand and kind of just write down your basal body temperature or your, like, the quality of your cervical fluid, the position of your cervix. Like I said, I have a note in my phone. You could just have a note in your phone or like a Google Doc or something. It doesn't necessarily have to be an app, but I do find that the apps can be really helpful. Just keep it organized in one place. And then some of them also prompt you about like your mood and then other symptomatic things that might be helpful to chart while you're tracking your cycle. So now I don't remember what I was just gonna say. So anyways, I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like if you become pregnant. So say you're using this for to become pregnant, you're using this information to help you become pregnant. You want to know when you're ovulating. So say, all right, my temperature jumped and now we're going to have sex. I have fertile cervical fluid. It's egg white consistency. It's stretchy, whatever. If you have sex while you think you're ovulating and you want to know if you have become pregnant before your missed period, this is kind of what that looks like. Again, this isn't going to be the same for everybody, but in general, this is what it's going to be. Your temperature stays elevated, so it's not going to drop back down before you bleed. So that it's going to be a little bit longer. And also, if you're tracking how many days your cycles are, obviously you're going to notice that you have a missed period, right? Obviously, you're not going to get your period, but sometimes there is a little bit of implantation bleeding. That's not going to be a lot, though. So it's really just going to be pink tinged cervical fluid. It's usually not a lot. Sometimes it can look like spotting, but you're not going to get a full period. You're going to have an increase in discharge or cervical fluid. So you're going to notice a like watery, runny consistency, maybe like milky cervical fluid. And there's going to be more of it than there usually is typically. And your cervix is going to be high and soft. So those are the main symptoms of very early pregnancy. Some women also just know instantly when they become pregnant, like immediately, like right after sex, they're like, yep, I got pregnant. And then lo and behold, they really did. So some women are just like really intuitively in tune with their body and they just know. I would say most women probably aren't. But yeah, sometimes women just know immediately. So, and you could take a birth control test at a birth control test. Oh my God. You can take a pregnancy test at any time, like right around when your period usually would be. So they're pretty good at detecting the hormone HCG that increases when you become pregnant. Usually they can detect it before your missed period or right around there. Not everybody is going to have a detectable amount of that hormone immediately. Most women do though, and most of the tests are pretty accurate.